Recently, Netflix released a docudrama produced and narrated by Jada Pinkett Smith, in which the historical figure of Cleopatra is portrayed by the black British actress Adele James. This has caused an uproar back in Egypt, where the government has sharply criticized the show for portraying Cleopatra as black rather than light-skinned, accusing the show of blackwashing Egyptian history. At the same time, there has been heavy criticism of an upcoming American film in which Gal Gadot, an Ashkenazi-descended Israeli actress, is cast as Cleopatra, leading to accusations of whitewashing instead. As a lecturer at New York University's History Department, I thought I'd give a historian's perspective on this controversy and try to answer the question regarding Cleopatra's race. What does the historical evidence say? Was she black, white, or brown? And why does it matter? I'd like to begin by categorically stating that she was not black, nor was she white, or brown. We'll get to what skin tone and facial features she probably had, but we should really begin by acknowledging that ancient peoples did not think of collective identity along racial lines. We in the modern West, especially if you live in the United States, have a very strong sense of racial identity, and we categorize ourselves and each other according to what we consider as racial identifiers, skin tone being one of them. This is not to say that ancient peoples were somehow unaware of different skin tones, or that they were colorblind, so to speak. In fact, there is plenty of art from ancient Egypt which depicts the people of the kingdom in a variety of skin tones. However, what historians argue is that these differences in skin tone were not markers and boundaries for collective identities in the ancient world, unlike how they are today. In the world in which we live, we identify as black, white, East Asian, and so on, based on various physical features such as skin tone. We understand ourselves to belong to different racial groups that have different genetic heritages, and see the people of our race as being biologically descended from ancestors that we share in common. Thus, people of the same race, whether they're a king, an aristocrat, or just a mere farmer, are seen as sharing a genetic commonality, a genealogical bond. However, the ancient understanding of genealogy and ancestry is very, very different. They had no notion of genetic connections tying together the ancestry of the ruling elites and the subject peasants under them. Quite the contrary, the ruling elites almost always claimed to be from an ancestry that was completely separate from and even uncontaminated by the rest of society, which was under their control. The fact that the peasants may or may not have had a similar skin tone and facial features to these royals was utterly irrelevant. And of course, the very fact that these royals came from a supposedly superior ancestry was part of the justification for why they had the right to rule over the low-born peasants in the first place. So not only did these kings and emperors distinguish their lineage and ancestry from the rest of society, but they usually went even further, claiming that they were descended from gods or other divine figures in contrast to the mere mortals over whom they ruled. Now, Cleopatra's dynastic family, the Ptolemaic dynasty, is a perfect example of this. This royal family was descended from one of Alexander the Great's main generals, Ptolemy, who was a Macedonian Greek and who positioned himself as the true successor to Alexander's legacy and empire. Just like Alexander, the Ptolemies also claimed to be divine figures, because Alexander claimed to be the son of Zeus, the king of the gods in the Greek pantheon. But after his conquest of Egypt, Alexander also claimed to be the son of Ammon, the chief Egyptian deity with two horns. In this coin, you can see how Alexander himself is depicted with horns, signifying his divine ancestry. Cleopatra's family carried on the divine cult of Alexander after his death, claiming to be lesser gods who were given custodianship to rule on Alexander's behalf. The Ptolemies then organized and led the worship of Alexander as a sort of divine priesthood, and by extension, they themselves were made divine through building temples for worshipping him and overseeing public rituals in his honor. The Ptolemies were quote-unquote temple-sharing gods, signifying that they were deified in association with their original god-king, Alexander. The Ptolemaic queens were also considered gods, just as their male counterparts were. For example, take Arsinoe II, who was given the title sibling goddess, or Cleopatra III, who carried the title of mother-loving goddess. As these titles suggest, the Ptolemies understood themselves to be a family of gods, and accordingly they were averse to contaminating their lineage and divine ancestry by marrying people from outside their family. As the title of sibling goddess clearly indicates, the Ptolemies continued the Egyptian royal tradition of inbreeding and sibling marriages to keep their bloodline pure. So this is the family of Cleopatra VII, which is the Cleopatra depicted in this docudrama and in films in general. Given this information, I find it jarring, if not outright embarrassing, when people make claims such as Cleopatra was black, don't let them deny our ancestry, or Cleopatra was light-skinned like you and I, don't let them steal our heritage and history. If any of these people could be placed into a time machine and transported back to Cleopatra's court, they would only embarrass themselves by claiming any sort of kinship with Cleopatra. In fact, they would probably get themselves executed. Imagine a non-royal, a mere peasant, shows up at the royal court and is somehow given an audience with the god queen Cleopatra and has the temerity to say, I don't know, something like, "You're my black sister," or "You're my Egyptian or Greek ancestor." Whatever claim to racial kinship and ancestry, common ancestry, it really doesn't matter. All of these would almost certainly be regarded as offensive or even blasphemous. Cleopatra and her family's entire ideology was based on being divine rulers whose ancestry tied them to gods, and here comes a mere mortal peasant and claims to share ancestry with the god queen. That is not only blasphemous, but the people in the court might interpret it as a challenge to Cleopatra's claim to the throne. They would ask themselves if this crazy person claiming to be a quote-unquote sister is actually putting a claim forward to be a descendant of Ptolemy and thus a rival heir to Cleopatra. Needless to say, it wouldn't end well. But what did she look like? This is probably a faithful depiction of Cleopatra. It's a bust from the time of her visits to Rome in 46 to 44 BCE. We don't know for sure whether the artist saw Cleopatra with his own eyes or was working from second-hand descriptions or even just his imagination. It's impossible to tell with absolute certainty, but given that Cleopatra's known ancestors hailed from Macedon, that they intermarried with Persian and Levantine nobility, and lastly also intermarried to some extent probably with local Egyptian elites and former royalty, we can guess that she probably looked something like a typical inhabitant of the Eastern Mediterranean region. So if you're looking for a modern-day country where a magically resurrected Cleopatra would be physically inconspicuous among the majority of the inhabitants there, then your best bet is perhaps Turkey, Lebanon, Egypt. These would be good examples. I have to emphasize that this is merely an informed guess, and it's entirely possible that Cleopatra was darker skinned or lighter skinned than the average inhabitant of the Eastern Mediterranean littoral. Possible, but I don't think that likely. In any case, I fail to see the significance of this as a historian. Discussions on race and skin color as the basis of identity really don't belong to the realm of ancient history. However, I think that each society usually reinterprets the past according to its own preconceptions and its own values. Take, for example, these 18th and 19th century European paintings which depict Cleopatra as a distinctly West European-looking woman, or even the 1963 film Cleopatra starring Elizabeth Taylor in the lead role. I think in all of these cases we see a depiction of Cleopatra which is made for a West European and North American white audience who like to see themselves reflected in the art that they consume. I think that the Netflix docudrama is not fundamentally different. As African Americans gain a larger share of film production and form an increasingly viable consumer base for such productions, we see that they too want to be reflected in the arts that they produce and consume. Both depictions of Cleopatra are, of course, anachronistic and out of line with historical evidence. But as a historian, I've come to understand that audiences do not go to the cinema or even watch documentaries to be shown a historically accurate picture. They want to be entertained and, just as importantly, for themselves and their values to be reflected in what they watch. If you watched this video and enjoyed it, I suggest you watch another video in which I discuss why Mad Max is a historically authentic film and how its main villain has a number of striking parallels with some actual historical rulers from Islamic history. If these are to your liking, then subscribe and click the notifications bell. Goodbye.